going to see a combination of a couple of different things. One around full time in office and reconsideration of full time in office, largely driven by, I think the cycle just got reset in some ways by Amazon making the decision to go back to 5 days a week, Dell following on with its sales team 5 days a week. When a company the scale of Amazon makes that decision, a lot of other companies pay attention to it. Amazon is by far the largest enterprise in technology now that has made a decision to go back full time in office. And it's quite different actually than their peer set. If you look at Alphabet or Meta or Apple or some of the other Nvidia, for example, the other large tech companies, Amazon is now the only one that requires full time in office 5 days a week. But those companies will, at least at the executive level, have the conversation and ask themselves, is there something that Amazon is seeing in their data that maybe we aren't seeing yet? Or are they on to something? And they may not change policy. There's been some discussion already within those companies. I think at town halls, employees have asked, and the answer broadly has been, we don't plan on changing our policy right now as long as the company stays productive and is doing well. But that door is opened a little bit in a way that it probably wasn't a few months ago. Beyond that, the companies that are smaller, maybe like a stage smaller, think about 100 billion to 500 billion in market cap, for example, will look at Amazon and say, if we want to be Amazon and get bigger, do we need to change our policy or visit differently? That will translate, I think, all the way down to the smallest companies and startups who admire Amazon's day one mentality and the aggressiveness of the culture in driving productivity and performance, and wonder if that's the approach they need to take. Now, I don't know how many companies will actually go in that direction yet, but a lot of them may be thinking about it. And we'll want to see what happens to Amazon from a talent perspective. Do they struggle a bit with people leaving the company because of the new policy? Does it actually impact performance? And does Amazon do well? What other feedback comes through? But it's at least opened that can of worms, Don, in some ways. I think it's changed in that regard. And so I think 2025 is going to be characterized by a lot of discussion on this topic and continued revisiting of, well, what are our peers doing? What does the data say? And as a result, what do we think is the right policy for us? It's always a hard job to be an HR executive, right? Like you're asked to balance so many things. You play such a critical role for the company. But I think this is a particularly difficult topic. One, I think you're right. HR executives will be squeezed a bit between executive teams or CEOs that want to push harder on this topic and employee feedback asking for more autonomy and control over where they work and how many days a week that looks like, their ability to choose those things. I think the second piece is uh, it's hard to monitor, as we were talking about before, and so I think HR teams will probably be asked to some extent for that, but my guess is it'll probably lean more on real estate teams that have access to badge data, IT teams to try and start to discover what's going on. So I don't think that will fall on HR shoulders alone. I think other folks will be asked to get involved, both from a technology perspective, and then quite often, unfortunately, it's the frontline manager that gets asked to enforce, and they end up with a similar issue where they're caught between employees and executives on the topic. So it's not just HR from an enforcement perspective. I do think the most forward thinking HR leaders will probably start to invest in their own data fluency, attaching not just badge data, but looking at how much time people spend in the office relative to performance metrics. Do we see any difference looking at employees that are in the office 2 days versus 3 days versus 4 days on performance when you do your performance cycle? Are we seeing any difference in engagement cut by time spent in office? Are we seeing difference in turnover rate? Or is our win rate up or down relative to other companies that have stricter or less strict policies? So I think in some ways, the best thing an HR executive can do is to start to get in the driver's seat a little bit of how this gets instrumented internally by starting to be more analytical and bringing some of that feedback and data to the conversation so that you can make good decisions based on what you're actually seeing within the employee base. It's a hard thing to prepare for because on the one hand, you might want to give more advance notice that people can plan. On the other hand, you create a lot of anxiety and start people searching for other jobs. This is not a perfect analogy, but in some ways, making a really big return to office change is kind of like doing a layoff, right? Where all of a sudden you create a bunch of fear and change across the full employee base. You cause a bunch of people to think about, is this the job they want, or do they want to leave their job? They have to start making a bunch of changes in terms of the way they plan their lives, right? It doesn't have the negative impact of people losing their job immediately, obviously, as a layoff does. But it's a similar type of discussion in terms of the impact and scale of the impact across an employee base. And so, yeah, in some ways, some of the principles across it are similar in the sense that you probably want to give some advanced sense that there's a conversation around it, but you don't want it to linger for months and months because that creates a lot of pain and uncertainty for folks. You want to try and communicate as clearly as you can around the expectations, the time horizon, how the company is going to support people in this time. Um, and then ultimately try and be as transparent as possible in the thought process and the data and what that means, both for existing employees, but also for candidates in the future. But it's a tough thing to plan for. I don't know if there's like a perfect answer. There's not decades of history and best practice in terms of like how do you prep for announcing return to office. And so I don't know if there's unfortunately like a single recipe for what HR leaders can do to get ahead of it. Over the last couple of years. We at Flex Index started tracking this data in the beginning of 2023. And so at the beginning of 2023, when we looked at it across the United States, roughly half of companies were full-time in office for corporate employees, and half of companies offered some level of work location flexibility, be that hybrid or fully remote. All of those kind of like bucketed in some level of work location flexibility. Quarter by quarter, we saw that decrease from the first quarter of 2023 all the way to the second quarter of 2024. In the second quarter of 2024, it had dropped all the way to 31% of companies were full-time in office and 69% offered work location flexibility. The third quarter, so last quarter of this year, we actually saw the first bend back, if you will, on full-time in office. So it went from 31% full-time in office to 33% full-time in office. And we put out that report in the middle of August 2024. And weeks later, Amazon made their change. And then weeks after that, Dell made their change. And so my instinct going into 2025 is I think we're going to see a little bit of continued bend back. Like, I think if I had to bet, if we're having this conversation at this time in 2025, that 33% number might be a little bit higher in terms of full-time in office. Do I think it's going to become the dominant model again? I don't, because I think that there's a bunch of advantages that companies that are hybrid are starting to embrace in terms of the radius of talent that they can attract people from, reduced real estate expense. I think it's a big employee topic, and the feedback is pretty meaningful. But there may be a little bit of pullback toward full-time in office. And one other nuance, which is unknown, is it depends also on the economy, right? Like if the economy achieves a soft landing in the United States and it feels like unemployment stays low and it stays very competitive for talent, that's probably going to limit some of the full-time in office pullback in the sense that people are competing pretty heavily for talent and they know that's not the most attractive model for the average employee. If the economy goes really south and it's a particularly hard landing, for example, you may see even more pull in that direction, especially if unemployment rises. It is not a set of companies that in 2022 were full-time in office and then 2023 made the decision to go hybrid and in 2024 are now going back to full-time in office. I don't think that's what's happening. What's happening is there are a set of companies that maybe were fully remote during the pandemic and then announced a return to office at some point in 2022 or 2023 and has ratcheted it up from there and is trying to get back to full-time in office. Amazon's a good example of that. Early in the pandemic, Amazon said, we're going to be remote first on a go forward basis. And then it became 2 days a week in the office at some point. And then I think last summer it became 3 days a week in the office. And then a couple months ago it became 5 days a week in the office. That's, I think, much more what it's been. Dell has followed a similar type of trend. In some ways, it's a little bit more boil the frog is the way that companies that are approaching full-time in office have been doing it, and they've been taking it day by day, and then employees take a little bit of pain, and then they take a little bit more pain, and then it goes back to full-time in office versus we went one direction and now we're going back to full-time in office.